Get back, now! Go, 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 go! 20 years, it's just gone. How did his house...
The house sat crooked at the end of Miller's Creek Road, no bigger than a 2-car garage, its cedar shingles silvered by 40 years of weather. Where every other house on the road had grown, additions bolted onto additions, 3-car garages, wraparound porches, Elias Vance's house had stayed exactly the same size since 1987. The town called it the shoebox, not always unkindly. Sometimes it was just a joke tossed between neighbors at the hardware store, but jokes have a way of hardening into something else when they're repeated enough. And by the time Denny Ashford built his 4,000-square-foot colonial directly across the creek from Elias's place, the shoebox had become something closer to a punchline the whole town shared without meaning to. Elias didn't mind, or didn't show it if he did. He was 71, built like a fence post, with hands that had shaped more houses in this county than any other pair of hands alive. He'd built half the porches on Miller's Creek Road. He'd framed the elementary school gymnasium. He'd repaired the steeple on First Baptist after the '99 windstorm took the cross clean off. But his own house, he'd built small, 900 square feet, 1 bedroom, a kitchen you could touch both walls of if you stretched out your arms. Man builds mansions for everybody else and lives in a dollhouse, Denny liked to say, usually loud enough to carry across the creek when Elias was out back stacking wood. Old fool never learned to spend money on himself. Elias would lift a hand in greeting, the way he always did, and keep stacking. His granddaughter, Wren, was the only one who ever asked him why. She was 19 that summer, home from her first year of community college, majoring in something undecided, living in the tiny second bedroom that used to be her mother's before her mother left for Charlotte and never quite came back. Wren had her grandfather's steady hands and her grandmother's quick temper, and she'd inherited neither the house pride nor the house shame of anyone else on the road. "Why'd you build it so small, Grandpa?" she asked one evening in June, sitting on the porch steps while he oiled a hand plane that had belonged to his own father. Elias didn't answer right away. He turned the plane over, checked the blade against the light. "Small house doesn't lie to you," he finally said. "Every board in this place I chose myself. Every joint I cut myself. I know exactly what's holding this roof up because I put it there with these 2 hands." He held them up, scarred, thick-knuckled, steady even now. "Big house? You don't always know that. You trust a crew you never met, working off blueprints they didn't draw, using lumber they didn't season. Man can live his whole life in a house he doesn't actually understand. That's it? That's the whole reason?" He almost smiled. "That, and the ridge beam." "What ridge beam?" "You'll see, if the wind ever comes hard enough." Wren laughed, thinking it was one of his riddles, the kind he'd given her since she was small. Half joke, half lesson, meant to be chewed on slowly. She didn't know yet that he meant it exactly, literally, as a fact about the framing above her head. She wouldn't understand until the sky turned green. The forecast had called for rain. Just rain, an inch, maybe 2, moving through by Thursday night. Nobody in town paid it much mind, because forecasts in this valley were wrong as often as they were right. Boxed in as they were by 2 mountain ridges that did whatever they wanted to weather systems passing through. Denny Ashford was grilling on his back deck Thursday afternoon when the color of the sky stopped him mid-flip. It wasn't gray, it wasn't the flat pewter of an ordinary storm. It had gone the sick yellow-green of old bruises, and the air had gone still in a way that felt less like calm and more like held breath. By 5 o'clock, the county emergency system pushed an alert to every phone in the valley. A supercell had formed over the ridge, moving faster than models predicted, carrying the kind of straight-line winds that flattened barns and peeled roofs like fruit skins. Tornado watch upgraded to warning within the hour. Wren was at the kitchen table doing nothing in particular, when her phone screamed its alert tone. She looked up to find her grandfather already at the window, one hand flat against the glass, watching the trees on the ridge bend sideways in a wind that hadn't reached the valley floor yet. "Grandpa, I know." His voice was calm in the particular way that told her it was serious. "Get the flashlights, get the radio, fill the bathtub. Shouldn't we go somewhere? The community center's got a basement." 14 minutes to the community center in good weather. "We don't have 14 minutes. He was already moving, checking the door hinges, the window latches, running a hand along the doorframe like he was greeting an old friend. "We stay here. In this house?" The words came out before she could stop them, sharper than she meant. Elias looked at her, and for just a moment, something passed behind his eyes. Not hurt, exactly. Something closer to the patience of a man who has been underestimated for so long, it no longer surprises him. "Especially in this house," he said. "Now go." Across the creek, Denny Ashford was shouting at his wife to get to the basement, and his basement, poured just 8 years ago by a contractor from 2 counties over, the cheapest bid he could find, had a crack running along the north wall that he'd meant to have looked at and never had. 3 doors down, the Kowalski family was piling into their minivan, trying to outrun the storm to the church 12 miles east, not knowing yet that the bridge over Miller's Creek would be the first thing to go. And half a mile up the ridge, in a farmhouse older than the town itself, an elderly widow named Ruth Okafor sat alone, with no working phone, no one who'd thought to check on her, and a roof that had been patched with tarps for 2 winters running because she couldn't afford the repair and was too proud to ask. The wind reached the valley floor at 6:47 p.m. It did not arrive gradually. The first gust hit Miller's Creek Road like a hand slamming a door. Wren felt the whole house shudder. Not shake, shudder. The way a living thing shudders when it braces against something. And then hold. Outside, the world became noise. Not wind noise, exactly, but a deep tearing roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, underscored by cracks that might have been thunder and might have been trees. Grandpa, she'd found him in the small hallway between the bedroom and the bathroom, the interior of the house, away from windows, exactly where he'd told her to go. Here. He pulled her down beside him, both of them sitting with their backs against the wall, and above them, through the ceiling, she could hear something she'd never noticed before. A deep, resonant groan of wood, flexing, working, absorbing force, and passing it downward instead of snapping. "That's the ridge beam," Elias said. And even now, even with the world tearing itself apart outside, there was something almost like pride in his voice. 12 by 14, old-growth oak, not a knot in 40 feet of it. Took me 3 men and a come-along to set it. Back in '87. Everybody said I was a fool to spend that kind of money on lumber nobody'd ever see. You can hear it working. That's what good wood does. It doesn't fight the load, it carries it. He tilted his head, listening the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. Rafters are 2 foot on center, doubled at every corner. Hurricane ties at every connection. I drove every one of those myself, because the crew doing the Ashford place across the creek told me hurricane ties were overkill for this valley. Outside, something enormous crashed down across the creek, the unmistakable, splintering collapse of a large structure meeting the ground all at once. Wren's whole body went cold. That sounded like... I know what it sounded like. The house shuddered again, harder this time, and somewhere a window Elias hadn't managed to board shattered inward, glass scattering across the kitchen floor, rain and wind screaming through the opening for the 3 or 4 seconds it took the interior door to hold against the pressure. Then it passed, the gust spending itself, and the roar outside dropped from a scream to a moan. They sat like that for 11 more minutes. Wren counted every one of them, until the wind began, gradually, to loosen its grip on the valley. When Elias finally stood and eased open the front door, what he saw stopped him in the frame. Across the creek, where Denny Ashford's 4,000-square-foot colonial had stood that morning, there was now a wound in the landscape. Walls folded outward, the roof entirely gone, insulation and shingles scattered across 3 lawns like confetti after a parade nobody wanted. The garage had collapsed sideways into what used to be the driveway, and standing in the wreckage, soaked to the skin, was Denny Ashford himself, staring at the ruin of everything he'd built with a face that had gone completely, terribly blank. Elias's own house stood exactly as it had that morning, a missing window, a few shingles gone from one corner, otherwise whole. "Grandpa," Wren whispered, staring across the creek. "You knew. You actually knew this could happen." "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I just didn't gamble on it not happening." It was Denny who knocked first, an hour later, once the worst of the wind had passed, and the rain had settled into something merely miserable instead of murderous. He stood on Elias's porch in a soaked t-shirt and bare feet, having lost his shoes somewhere in the chaos of getting his wife out of the collapsing garage, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Elias opened the door and looked at him. Really looked, the way he'd look at a piece of lumber to check it for rot, and saw a man who had lost, in the space of 20 minutes, nearly everything he owned. "Come in," Elias said. "Both of you." Denny's wife Carol was crying, without quite seeming to notice she was crying, the way people do in shock. Elias got them both blankets from the closet, got the wood stove going even though it was June, because shock needs warmth more than season dictates. "I don't understand," Denny said, sitting at Elias's small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he wasn't drinking. "We paid for the best. Best contractor in 3 counties. Best materials, they told us. Premium package." He laughed, but it came out broken. "And your little shoebox is standing there like nothing happened." "Best isn't always what they say it is," Elias said. He wasn't gloating. Wren, watching from the hallway, could see there was nothing of "I told you so" in her grandfather's face. Only a kind of tired sorrow. Best is what holds when nobody's watching, premium package or not. If the crew used 2-foot spacing where you needed 16-inch, if they skipped hurricane ties because the inspector didn't ask to see them, if they built to the code minimum instead of the actual weather this valley gets. He stopped himself. "Doesn't matter now. What matters is you and Carol are safe. The house, we can talk about later." "There won't be a later," Denny said, and something in his voice cracked open. "Insurance is going to fight us on this. We're underinsured." I skimped on the policy because the premium was too high for full replacement. "We put everything into that house, Elias. Everything." Outside, more knocks were beginning, the sound of a whole street beginning to understand what had happened to it. Wren looked out the window and saw the Kowalski family's minivan being winched out of Miller's Creek by a county tow truck, the bridge behind it a snapped ruin of concrete and rebar. She saw neighbors wandering their own yards in the gray afterstorm light, looking for things that used to be walls. And half a mile up the ridge, though no one in the valley yet knew it, Ruth Okafor was sitting in the dark with a hole in her roof the size of a car door, water running down what remained of her kitchen ceiling, waiting for a phone that wasn't going to ring, because nobody had thought, in the chaos, to check on the widow who lived alone. It was Wren who remembered her. She was helping her grandfather board up the broken window when the thought surfaced, sudden and cold. Mrs. Okafor. Nobody's checked on Mrs. Okafor. Ruth Okafor had lived alone on the ridge for 6 years, since her husband died, in a farmhouse that had been in his family for 3 generations. She kept to herself mostly, walked into town once a week for groceries, waved politely, declined most invitations with a gentle firmness that discouraged follow-up. The town had, without quite deciding to, stopped thinking about her. "Grandpa," Mrs. Okafor. Elias's hands stilled on the plywood he was holding. "God help me, you're right." He set the sheet down. "Nobody's been up that road tonight. It'll be worse than here. She's higher, more exposed." And that farmhouse roof's 50 years old if it's a day. I'll come with you, Ren. I'm coming, Grandpa. You're 71. If a tree's down across that road, you're not moving it alone. He looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of a man recognizing, all at once, that the child he still half-pictured has become someone capable of arguing him down, and nodded. They took his old truck, the one with real ground clearance and chains he kept in the bed, out of habit older than most people's memory of hurricanes. The road up the ridge was a nightmare of downed limbs and standing water, and twice Elias had to stop and drag debris clear with his bare hands, while Ren held the flashlight and watched the tree line nervously for anything else that might come down. They found the farmhouse dark, one whole section of roof caved inward over what had been the kitchen. Ruth Okafor was sitting in her living room by candlelight, wrapped in every blanket she owned, her breath fogging faintly in air that had gone cold with the rain pouring through her ceiling. She wasn't panicked. She looked, if anything, resigned, like a woman who had long ago made peace with the idea that no one was coming. Mrs. Okafor, Elias crouched in front of her chair. "It's Elias Vance. We're going to get you somewhere warm." She looked up at him, and something in her face, the surprise of being seen, being remembered, being come for, nearly undid her composure entirely. "I didn't think," she said quietly, "that anyone would think of me tonight." "We should have thought of you before tonight," Elias said, and Ren heard in his voice a guilt that went back further than one storm. "That's on all of us, not just tonight." They got her down the mountain wrapped in blankets, her small overnight bag packed with the few things she'd grabbed in the dark. A photograph of her late husband, a hand-carved wooden box, a worn Bible with a cracked spine. By the time they got back to Miller's Creek Road, Elias's tiny house had become, without anyone deciding it should, the only fully intact shelter for a quarter-mile in any direction. By midnight, there were 11 people crowded into 900 square feet. Denny and Carol Ashford on the couch. The Kowalski family, 2 exhausted parents and 3 children who'd fallen asleep the moment they stopped moving, spread across every available inch of floor space, with blankets Elias hadn't known he owned that many of. Ruth Okafor in the one armchair, wrapped in quilts, finally warm. A young lineman named Marcus who'd been trapped by downed wires 2 streets over and had nowhere else dry to go. Ren moving between all of them, with mugs of tea and words of reassurance she didn't entirely feel herself. And Elias, moving through his own crowded house with the calm of a man who had built it, in some sense, for exactly this, though he would never have said that out loud, and had never imagined it quite so literally. "How does it hold?" Carol Ashford asked at one point, staring up at the low ceiling with something between wonder and grief. "How does a house this small hold 11 people and not even creak?" "It was built to hold weight," Elias said simply. "Weight's weight. Doesn't matter if it's snow load or people load. You build the frame right. It doesn't know the difference between a storm and a crowd." Denny, sitting hollow-eyed on the couch with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands, spoke without quite meaning to. "I called you a fool. For years. Every time I saw you out here with your little house, I thought, what a waste. What a small, sad little life he's built for himself." He looked up. "I built 4,000 square feet on a foundation some subcontractor poured in 11 days because that's what the schedule demanded. I never once asked what was actually holding my house up. I just assumed, because I paid enough, it would hold." "Assuming's the mistake," Elias said, not unkindly. "Not the money. Money's just money. The mistake was thinking, money buys you out of paying attention." Ruth Okafor, from her armchair, spoke for the first time in several minutes. "My husband used to say something like that. About the farm, about everything. He said the land doesn't care what you can afford. It only cares what you actually did." She looked at her ruined roof photograph, the one she'd salvaged, and something in her face softened with old grief. I let that roof go 2 winters because I was too proud to ask for help, and too broke to pay full price. Pride's expensive too, just a different currency. The room went quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable quiet, but the particular quiet of people recognizing something true. Wren, sitting on the floor near the wood stove, looked up at her grandfather and understood, finally and completely, the answer he'd given her weeks ago on the porch steps. A small house doesn't lie to you. It wasn't really about the size of the house at all. It was about the difference between what you build to be seen and what you build to actually last, and how rarely, in this world, those turned out to be the same thing. The storm passed fully by 3 in the morning, and dawn came up gray and strange over a valley that looked like it had been chewed by something enormous. Miller's Creek Road was a wreckage field. Denny's Colonial was a total loss. The insurance adjuster would later confirm, though loss felt like too small a word for what stood in his yard now. A wound where a life used to be. 3 other houses on the road had lost roofs entirely. The bridge over the creek was gone, replaced by a scar of broken concrete and twisted rebar that would take the county 8 months to rebuild. And Elias Vance's 900-square-foot house, with its missing window and its handful of lost shingles, stood exactly where it had stood for 39 years. By 7 in the morning, word had begun to spread through the county, not through any deliberate telling, but the way news moves through small towns, mouth to mouth to mouth. The Vance place made it through untouched, held 11 people overnight. Vance and his granddaughter drove up the ridge in the worst of it to get Ruth Okafor out. By 9, the local news van was parked at the end of what used to be the driveway, and a reporter named Sarah Chen was picking her way across debris with a cameraman close behind, looking for the story everyone in the county was already telling each other. She found Elias out back, already at work, not on his own house, which needed only minor repair, but helping the Kowalski family clear debris from what remained of their roofline, moving with the unhurried competence of a man who had done this kind of work his whole life and intended to keep doing it as long as his hands would let him. Mr. Vance. Sarah held out a hand, and he shook it, though his own was covered in sawdust and grime. Folks are calling your house a miracle this morning. Elias considered that for a moment, setting down the crowbar he'd been using. It's not a miracle, he said. A miracle's something that happens without an explanation. This has got a real simple explanation. I built it right, 40 years ago, and I never stopped checking on it since. He gestured toward the collapsed colonial across the creek. Not unkindly, more like a man pointing out a lesson written plainly in the landscape. That's not bad luck over there. That's 40 different small decisions, made by 40 different people who each figured somebody else would catch the mistake. Nobody did. The storm just showed everybody what was already true. What would you say to people watching this? Sarah asked. Who are thinking about their own homes right now, wondering if they'd hold up? Elias looked past the camera, past the reporter, out toward the ridge where Ruth Okafor's farmhouse sat, with its roof half open to the sky, toward the bridge that would need to be entirely rebuilt, toward all the small choices that had, cumulatively, decided who slept warm last night and who didn't. I'd say, check on your neighbors before the storm comes, not after, and check on what's actually holding your roof up, not what somebody told you was holding it up. Those 2 things, he said, picking the crowbar back up, would have saved this whole street a world of grief. The rebuilding took the better part of a year. Denny and Carol Ashford, waiting on an insurance settlement that would cover barely half of what they'd need, ended up renting a small place in town. Smaller, in fact, than Elias's house, an irony Denny brought up himself, ruefully, more than once. When they finally did rebuild, Denny hired a different contractor. He asked, this time, about spacing and ties and load calculations, questions he'd never thought to ask before, because he'd finally understood, the hard way, the expensive way, that money spent without attention was money spent blind. Ruth Okafor's roof got fixed within the month, not by insurance, which barely covered farmhouse repairs on a property that old, but by a work crew that assembled itself almost spontaneously out of Miller's Creek Road. Denny swinging a hammer alongside Elias, the Kowalski father running lumber, Marcus, the young lineman, donating a week of vacation time to wire the place properly. Nobody organized it, exactly. It simply happened, the way water finds its level, once people had been reminded what it felt like to be forgotten and then found. Ruth herself began coming down the ridge more often after that, not out of obligation, but because something had shifted in her, some old wall of pride finally worn thin enough to let a little warmth through. She and Elias fell into an easy, unhurried friendship built on shared quiet and mutual respect, the kind that asks nothing and offers everything. Wren changed her major that fall, from undecided to structural engineering, though she couldn't have said, if pressed, exactly when the decision had crystallized. Maybe it was the sound of the ridge beam groaning above her head in the dark, doing its quiet, essential work. Maybe it was watching her grandfather's hands, steady, certain, honest, move through the wreckage of other people's mistakes, fixing what could be fixed. Either way, she spent the following summer as Elias's unofficial apprentice, learning to read a house the way he did, not by its square footage, but by its bones. The bridge over Miller's Creek was finally rebuilt the following spring, wider and higher than before, engineered to a standard the old bridge had never met. The county named it, without much ceremony but with evident feeling, the Vance Crossing, not because Elias had asked for the honor, he hadn't, but because the county commissioner, standing at the ribbon cutting, said simply that it seemed right to name a bridge meant to hold firm after the man on the road who'd shown them all what holding firm actually looked like, the house that told the truth. Elias Vance still lives in the shoebox. He's 72 now, slower in the mornings than he used to be, though his hands haven't lost their steadiness. Wren visits most weekends, home from her engineering program 2 counties over, and the two of them still sit on the porch steps some evenings, though the conversation has changed. She asks him about shear walls now, about wind load calculations, about the difference between what a building code requires and what a good builder actually does. He answers the way he always has, patiently, plainly, trusting her to do the harder work of understanding on her own time. Nobody calls the house a shoebox anymore. Somewhere in the year after the storm, without anyone quite deciding it, the nickname simply stopped being funny, and then stopped being used at all. What replaced it wasn't a new nickname so much as a kind of quiet deference, the recognition, hard-won, and unlikely to be forgotten, that the smallest house on Miller's Creek Road had turned out to be the truest one. Denny Ashford still lives across the creek, in a house half the size of his old one, built by his own hands with Elias's guidance, every board of it chosen and understood. He says, sometimes, that losing the big house was the best thing that ever happened to him, though he says it quietly, the way people say things they're still a little ashamed, took a disaster to teach them. And some evenings, when the light goes long and gold over the ridge, Elias walks the perimeter of his little house the way he has for 39 years, checking the sill plates, running a hand along the corner posts, listening for anything that doesn't sound the way it should. Not because he doubts the house, because he built it to be understood, board by board, joint by joint, and understanding a thing well enough to trust it means never quite stopping the checking. A house can't lie to you, he tells Wren. Most times she asks him why he still walks the perimeter after all these years. If you were the one who built it truthfully in the first place. It is, in the end, the only kind of house worth building, the kind that holds, not because it was expensive, or impressive, or large enough to be seen from the road, but because someone cared enough, in the quiet and unwatched hours of its making, to get every single thing right.
Everyone laughed at the shoebox. Nobody's laughing now. And here's what actually gets me about this story. It was never really about the house. It was about the difference between building something to be seen and building something to be trusted. Elias didn't need anyone's approval. He just needed every board to be right. That's rare. Most of us are building something right now, a career, a relationship, a reputation, and quietly hoping nobody checks too closely underneath. So ask yourself honestly, if your storm came tomorrow, what would still be standing? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you're building the right way, even when nobody's watching. And if this story stuck with you, subscribe, hit that bell, and I'll see you in the next one.